Next up, we have Professor Dr. Georg Schomerus. She's a full professor of psychiatry at Radboud University of Leipzig and chair of the Department of Psychiatry and Psychotherapy at the University of Leipzig Medical Center. His scientific work focuses on the stigma of different health conditions like mental illness, substance abuse, and long COVID. Dr. Schomerus is leading the ongoing long-term representative national stigma study in Germany, and he's the author of several books and book chapters and more than 250 peer-reviewed scientific papers.
Okay, and after getting all the data by Ronja, this is more a conceptual talk asking whether the stigma concept can be relevant for people with long COVID, because many people with long COVID really refer to very stigmatizing experience, and in the context of an illness that has provoked controversy, so people feel stigmatized. And the topic of my talk is whether the lens of stigma can actually explain or helpfully explain what happens to people with long COVID, or how society actually deals with this new old condition, as we have heard. Stigma is a concept coming from sociology. Goffman is probably a familiar name, but Bruce Link on the left-hand side and his partner Joe Fallon, they wrote a quite influential paper in 2001 conceptualizing the stigma process using kind of psychological mechanisms to describe something that is happening in a societal context, starting with labeling a condition. The labels give rise to stereotypes that are attached to the labeled person, negative stereotypes that lead to emotional reactions like anger or fear, which leads to separation, to a distinction between us, the majority or the powerful group, and them, the others, which then leads to discrimination. And this makes the stigma process relevant because discrimination is injustice. People are treated differently and treated worse because of their condition. And this all happens in a surrounding, or it requires a power differential. So there's a powerful group of the majority that is stigmatizing a group with considerably less power. So when I'm talking about psychiatry, for example, I can say that the staff on a ward, although not in the majority, they can still stigmatize certain patients because they have the structural power in that setting. But if the patients kind of gather and talk bad about the psychiatrist, that's not stigma because they don't have the power to actually hurt the psychiatrist, for example. So the power context is relevant. And now, first, I'm trying to apply this process to how the public sees long COVID. And my anchor is an editorial that appeared in a very prominent German newspaper, the Süddeutsche Zeitung, by a quite well-known medical journalist. And the headline was "Post-COVID, millions of euros for the wrong cause." And in this text, he describes the post-COVID community as being mentally unstable because that's thought to be a risk factor. And then he goes on, the chronically fatigued invest a lot of energy in social media, insulting anyone who dares to mention that the condition shows a tendency towards self-healing and involves psychological factors, because then a group of noisy activists concludes the money would be better spent on research on dementia, Parkinson's, or multiple sclerosis, i.e. real diseases that have a palpable cause that we can actually treat. And I mean, that was really annoying, but it was also clearly stigmatizing because he used labels. I mean, not only long COVID, but also the chronically fatigued, kind of mocking them for their condition. And then he transported a lot of stereotypes. They are noisy, they are mentally unstable, they are aggressive. And obviously the aim was to provoke an emotional reaction, being angered, being annoyed by these people who are noisy and who demand things that we are not ready to give them, because as a result, their unfounded claims need to be rejected, and that results in probably a lack of resources or a denial of resources or a weaker position in the competition for resources that is always happening in the healthcare system. So I think there's good reason to say, well, there is stigma at work, but why? I mean, why should people with long COVID be stigmatized? I mean, they're not hurting anyone. I mean, they're not disturbing the order. They're just, often they're confined to their bedrooms or are just weakened. So they're not really a danger. So I think to understand the stigma of long COVID, we have to answer the question, what is it that annoys people about long COVID? Or what is it that provokes this resistance against a severe, unpleasant, and otherwise not really dangerous disorder? And for that, I will refer to Jo Fallon. We have seen her picture on the right-hand side earlier, who synthesized many years ago the literature on prejudice and stigma, asking whether this is actually the same concept from different backgrounds. And she synthesized that into three major functions of stigma, which I find quite helpful to understand why stigma is used. Because stigma is always a societal process that has some purpose. It has a reason to be there. And she distinguishes three functions of stigma. First, to keep people in. That is the moral stigma, for example, of a sexually deviant behavior that we don't want to have. The queer community is subject to this moral stigma. They are behaving in a wrong way. So we want them to be different, to be like us. And if they're not, we stigmatize them. Another motive is to keep people down, like anti-migrant stigma or racism or some underprivileged group that is threatening the privileges of the majority or the powerful group is getting stigmatized to keep them on that lower position. And we can say that sexism or misogyny might also be conceived like that. We, the men, try to keep the women down so that our privileges are not endangered. And the third reason for stigma is keep people away. That is the classical disease stigma like leprosy or maybe also HIV. In the early stages, I fear getting infected or getting contaminated. So I keep them on a distance. But it's also, when we come to mental illnesses, a stigma associated with fear that if some behavior is unpredictable or dangerous, I'm keeping my distance because I can't really judge how dangerous this could be for me. And I will show, or I think that actually in long COVID, all three motives play a role. And I just briefly talk about that. We have heard from Paula that the chronic fatigue syndrome is has an overlap with the classical concept of hysteria, and that is a misogynistic concept. I mean, that has been women who have been devaluated in their experiences. And because the majority of patients with long COVID are women, it is likely that these female symptoms are devalued because that's just a tradition of a male-dominated medical systems, or at least a male-dominated medical thinking that is taking symptoms of women less serious than symptoms of men. And that is proven, like pain or all kinds of symptoms, if they're experienced by women, they're taken often less seriously. And so we could say, well, hypothesis one is we keep long COVID is stigmatized because men are keeping women down. So if this would be a disease primarily affecting men, we would probably deal different with it, maybe. Hypothesis two is the moral hypothesis, and I think that we will hear more about that later, that if it's perceived as a, well, I should say, sorry, I just go back. The way to stigmatize that is psychologization, because if we don't take it seriously, we say, well, it's all in the psyche, it's all imagined, or it's not a real disease, and that's the way how symptoms of women are devalued, just by attributing them to the mind and not to the body. And that's also, and if we do that, if we psychologize long COVID, then it's a seemingly voluntary behavior. So this retraction from my duties or from the demands of society is then perceived as a voluntary behavior of people who demand help, or demand our considerations or demand resources. And that is contrary to what we expect from the individual. We want everybody to help themselves, to recover, to really to put in an effort to and they're actually denying the effort because they say, well, we have post-exceptional malaise. We can't, if we put in effort, we are actually getting worse. So they're really opposing this very basic value of our society that everybody really has to put effort in their own pursuit of life and happiness and performance. And that might just go contrary to very deeply held values in our society. So we stigmatize them because they are questioning these values that we all rely on. And the final hypothesis is keeping people away because of fear of infection. And that is kind of counterintuitive because we all know that long COVID is anything but infectious. I mean, it's even the term post-COVID says, well, it's not COVID anymore. This is something else. So there is no fear of actual infection or contracting the disease. But if you look at what the people critical of the long COVID movement or the long COVID community say, and that's a German interview in the other big German newspaper, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, by the neurologist Christian Kleinschnitz. Yeah, sorry. But I didn't put it on the slide. And he says, I believe if we wouldn't hear anything about long COVID for a year, these high incidences would just disappear. So he thinks, well, it's contagious because if we talk about it, more people get it. If you write about it, more people get it. So it's a psychological contamination that he's fearing. And I think that is something that I've also heard anecdotally, that from parents with a child with long COVID, that the child and youth psychiatrists say, well, don't mention long COVID, don't talk about it, because otherwise the child will never be able to let go of that imagined concept, which is quite what Paula also said. So I think there is a fear of contamination. Long COVID is stigmatized because it is perceived as being psychologically contagious. And so I think psychologization is really at the core of these different motives, and it would be challenging or interesting to try to investigate that, to put data behind these considerations. And we only have this data that we know that from people who have long COVID, that the more they feel or the more they experience being psychologized, the more they also experience stigma. And these are pretty high correlation coefficients, so that in the experience of people, the link between psychologization and stigma is quite strong. And yeah, so that's my point. Thanks for your attention.